Hello, everybody, and welcome to Stories from the Path. This is episode 9, and I'm so grateful that you could join us tonight. Thanks so much for taking the time to spend an hour with us, and a special thanks to my dear friend and our guest, Anella Wetter. I met Anella and her husband, Craig, who are sitting side by side with me right now. I kind of like it, at the Infinite Possibilities Conference in Chicago in August of 2014, and even though we hardly spoke at all at that conference, I could recognize the similarity in their spiritual partnership that they had, that my wife Christiane and I have, and we sort of made a commitment or a promise to connect again further down the road. And it's a promise that I'm really grateful that we've kept for ourselves, and I'm grateful that they're a part of my life and continue to grow into a deeper part of my life. I had the chance to spend some time with them in their beautiful home in Lexington earlier this, I guess it was actually last summer, and they've been to Chicago since. And we continue to get to know each other better and share a lot of life stories. We'll give Anella a more proper introduction or so in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about what tonight's show is going to look like first. So this is a 60-minute interview and conversation. During that time, it'll just be Anella and I talking, and she'll be sharing a lot of pieces of her life story. Along the way, you may have some questions you'd like to ask, and don't worry, you'll get your chance. At the end, we'll have a brief comment and or question and answer period. You can also type comments into the comment box if you're on video chat with us right now. We'll tie this whole thing up at 8:15 for sure. We usually end at about 8, even 8:05 at the latest. But no matter what's happening at 8:15, we do wrap the show because I like to honor people's time and space, and I like people to know that they can come to this program and not have to leave in between and have that sort of complex of walking out and wondering how long it's going to go. So promise not later than 8:15, probably more like 8 o'clock. So how did this thing get started? I'll tell you a little bit about how this got started. Like a lot of things that happened in my life, it started with a few small steps. So what's ironic is about a year ago, I had no idea that video format or connecting online with people actually worked. As a matter of fact, I pretty much attested to most people that I didn't think it worked. But I really wound up eating those words when my wife encouraged me to try a webinar. And I tried one at the beginning of 2016, and I think I'm into my 30th or 35th webinar by now between the men's forums that I do, these broadcasts, and some other stuff that I do. And I've really learned that it's not the distance between people that cause separation. It's actually the separation that creates the separation. So I've learned to navigate around some walls that I had in my mind. And I'm really grateful to have these types of platforms to share experiences with people. And in this year or year and a half that I've been doing this, I've learned a lot of stuff. But really the most significant thing I've learned is we're all exactly the same people. We're just all one of the same kind, of the same race, no matter what happens. And we're all heroes in our own individual life journeys. And that's why we connect with other people sharing their stories, because there's pieces of their stories that we understand, even if the plot lines aren't the same. We're all going to have dreams and desires. We're all going to travel and go on journeys. We're going to find people who help us on the way, our mentors and our aides. We're going to face challenges, and we're going to get scared, and we're going to be tempted by the dark side, if you will. And then we're going to reach some sort of crossover. We'll be at an abyss, and we'll get to an awakening and suffer some sort of tragedy, but then have a rebirth, and then we'll find contentment with what we've learned. And this is just a circle that goes on and on as the new desires form. And if you've read A Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell, you're very familiar with this line. And in my mind, it really is a piece of any tale, any speech, any story we ever do. We're all on this same hero's journey. So tonight's broadcast is really preparation meeting opportunity. I started to prepare to do interviews about a year and a half ago. I dove in and started doing them a year ago, and there's nothing I like doing more. So we're going to get started and actually talk now to our special guest, Anella. And I want to give you a little introduction before we get started in the interview. So Anella is a speaker, a writer, and a coach. She focuses on empowering women to grow from their cracked open hearts. Anella coaches women through relationship transitions, divorce, post-divorce dating, and attracting in the ideal match, which apparently she's very good at. Last year, she transitioned from a part-time career woman and a part-time yoga teacher to a full-time badass empowerment coach, and she hasn't looked back since. While yoga continues to be a big part of Anella's path, she's now building a coaching business on a platform of shared experiences, her own personal vulnerability, and as she calls it, her fierce determination. On Valentine's Day of this year, Anella published her book titled Hear Me Universe, which is a story of how she created a powerful visualization in the form of a list of 100 characteristics she was looking for in her perfect spiritual partnership. And that list led her to her marriage with her now husband, Craig, who I've already introduced in the show, and so many other things beyond that. Anella made herself a priority in her own life for the first time. And tonight she'll be talking about her challenging transformations, lots of magical serendipities, earth angels she's met, past lives, letting go, and so many other things. So let's now officially welcome to the show my friend Anella Wetter. Hello, Anella.
Hi, Jim. So grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun hour here that we're going to spend together. I've had the chance to talk to Anella for a couple of hours in preparation for this, and she's got some really great stuff to share with you. So you're living in Lexington. It's interesting because we're sort of in this period of focus where like nearly the entire world is focusing on March Madness and college basketball and in the hotbed of it right there in the home of the University of Kentucky, which is your alma mater. Is that correct?
That is correct, Jim. Yes. And I'll say with a slight chagrin that I'm not the biggest fan. I mean, I like the team, but I don't follow them really closely. So I'm a bit of an anomaly in this town right now.
Yeah, I'd imagine 90% of the people are obsessed with college basketball in Lexington, right?
Completely obsessed. And I have tuned in for the last couple of games for the most part. But yes, it is March Madness, and this is a hot seat for it.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I can't even imagine what it's like down there now. So tell us why Lexington, with the ability to live and do the work that you do from pretty much anywhere on this planet, what is it about Lexington that calls you there?
Yeah, so Lexington has called me specifically 4 distinct times in my life. So I've moved to Lexington 4 times. I came here first as an undergraduate. I grew up in central Kentucky, and Lexington is about an hour and a half away. And then in my adult life, I moved back 3 distinct times. And so obviously Lexington has a pull on me. And what I really love about this community is, first of all, it is really driven by the university that's here, the University of Kentucky, which brings, a beautiful intellectual and academic element and a commitment to a full range of the arts. And I appreciate and value all of those things. And then it's also true, interestingly, that any healing modality that you might be seeking is to be found here in central Kentucky. And then there's a further kind of underlying magic that is captured in a book called The Keys of Enoch, Enoch. A pretty old book that a friend shared with me just a couple of years ago, which is a book that I guess future casts the spaces in the world where healing will happen. And this area of central Kentucky is highlighted in that book. We are geographically, or I should say geologically, on a huge bed of limestone, and there are all kinds of healing properties from limestone. It's one of the elements that makes our horses strong and run fast. And so it's just a very, very unique place in the world. On top of that, it is a really progressive and a very liberal community, and I'm proud of that. And we are very blessed by fabulous restaurants and interesting craft beer industry and a lot of live music. So it has so much appeal. And I think the final thing for me is this is the town in which I raised my children. They both graduated from high school here. And so it remains a touch point for them. And I like being able to offer that to them. They're both in their 20s. Actually, my daughter's 30. But for me and my mom heart, I like being able to offer that.
Yeah. And I've only passed through there once, but I feel called to come back. So I totally understand that pull. Now, you were born in the state of Kentucky, though, but in a more rural place, correct?
That's right.
So what, about 2 hours outside of Lexington? Is that it? So, and it was a much different sort of lifestyle in your birth town than it is in Lexington then, yes?
Yeah, so the town I grew up in still doesn't have a traffic light.
Wow.
And maybe has a population of 500 or 600 people. So yeah, a very different experience, a beautiful experience, but
Mhm.
very different.
And your parents were farmers, correct?
That's right.
So you told me that led to you having grandmothers that played a really significant role in your life because of that.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about your two grandmothers and the differences between the two of them, and what a sort of role they played in your life in your youth.
Yeah, so being raised by farmers, that meant I was being raised by parents who were very, very committed and dedicated to the farm, and that meant long hours. And so I spent a lot of time with my maternal and my paternal
Hmm.
grandmothers, and they couldn't have been more different. So my dad's mother was Southern Baptist, really steeped in her religion, and unfortunately, really had chosen a fear-based life,
Hmm.
and which brought her a lot of sadness and pain and heartache, and ultimately um, led her to a path of being treated for mental illness in the 70s through electroshock therapy, which is a super, super sad experience for my family. And on the other hand, my maternal grandmother, who was vivacious and full of life, who for whom religion had played a role. She was raised Irish Catholic, but had chosen not to cultivate that in her life, and she had this vivaciousness and desire to pull me up to the counter and hand me the mixer when I was 5 years old and let me be. And so it was just a completely different experience, one that felt super restrictive and one that felt really expansive.
Yeah. So then your family sort of deferred to the father's side religion wise then, and you were raised a Southern Baptist?
Yeah, that's correct. My mom came to the relationship with my dad really seeking a lot of stability that she didn't feel she had growing up. Her father was an alcoholic. Um, yeah, there were, I think, was some tumult in her family. And so I remember her saying, even as a child, that she was so grateful for my father and his family because it offered her what she felt she had been missing in her life.
Yeah. Yeah. So you told me in your own words that you were highly conforming until you reached your mid-teens, yes?
Highly conforming.
Yeah. But then something shifted, right? And you told me one day you sort of told your dad that you didn't really want to go to church anymore. And how did he answer that question?
hmm Yeah, so his answer was, as long as you're my daughter and the church doors are open,
Yeah,
you will be there.
exactly.
Yeah, and so it did represent, one of the first times in my life that I overtly
Mhm.
um, disagreed with my father, which is a pretty big moment for me.
Yeah. Now I want to fast forward for just a second here because I know when you were raising your kids in the earlier years that you really chose to be a part of a church because it created some sort of community and foundation for you, but you chose to go to a Methodist church in that situation. Tell us a little bit about how the three major churches played into what your lifestyle was like in that town and why you chose the Methodist church.
Yeah, so the town I grew up in, sort of, I don't know, classic Midwestern town, and on the same street there was a Methodist, a Baptist, and a Christian church, and my family was affiliated with the Baptist church. And so when I had my own family and was raising children in my 20s, one of the things that I definitely wanted was a church that was more open and embracing of the role of a woman.
Yeah.
And so the Methodist church, sort of out of the landscape from which I knew to choose,
Hmm.
offered that. And so that was the major attraction
Hmm.
of the Methodist church.
Yeah. So you gave your children sort of a different choice, though, when they reached that same age, when they sort of said, Mom, we don't
Mhm.
really want to go to church anymore. You sort of, in your own words, said you sort of broke up with the church. Yes.
Yeah, I had made a decision, maybe even when I was a teenager, subconsciously, but it came to the forefront when I had children. And the decision was I was not going to be the parent who forced them
Yeah.
to show up at anything, let alone church. And so I committed to myself and to them, and I was really open with them that I would support them. I would shuttle them there. I would be there with them. And when they no longer saw the need, the desire, the support that church offered, then it was up to them. It was really their choice in life.
And it was interesting. You said to me that when you left the church, it was like nobody really even noticed.
Yeah, it was interesting. So we were attending a fairly large congregation, and I think that does lend to the invisible opportunity that can bring. But I was not highly involved, and so when I chose to leave, it went largely unnoticed, and that was a good thing. It felt like a perfect exit.
Yeah. And if I'm correct, that departure from the church sort of corresponded with the unraveling of your first marriage, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it did.
So you were married for 22 years.
I was.
I know a lot of people here are going, okay, she has a daughter that's 30. She's been married 22 years. She has another husband. How does this defy it doesn't add up to the that I'm looking at when I see your face. Yes. So I can relate to what it was like to be married for a long time, because I was married for 18 years prior to my current marriage, Christiana. And really many of those years were really good. The majority of them were fine or good enough. And I asked you, if a large part of your marriage was fine, and you said yes. But at some point something shifted. So what shifted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the first shift was really at about year 10 or 11.
Mm-hmm.
And that shift really was me asking for what I wanted, something that felt truly important to me to support our family. And, that request went unfulfilled, in fact, was rejected. And I so remember, and now that I understand human energy much better, I remember in that moment my thoughts. And my thoughts were, so I just say it here as my thoughts were, fuck you, I'll do it myself.
Yeah.
And that energetic divide began then. So I can look back and see that clearly now.
Yeah. I totally understand that. So you decided basically that you needed to start to define yourself, right? And then, as you said, you really at some point decided that wasn't going to be possible within the confines of that marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a moment, probably 3 years before I took action to file divorce, where, again, in my thoughts, it was so clear. And the words were, oh, God, I am going to have to divorce this man. And that was really clear to me. And it took me a while to find the courage to do that.
Yeah, because that meant you were going to be abandoning roles that you'd assumed, right? You assumed the role of wife, mother, obedient, servant within, all of these things. And there was something about your fierce, independent spirit that we referenced in the beginning call that just sort of encouraged you to say, you know what, I have to do this. Fine isn't good enough. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the other role, Jim, was family manager.
Yes.
Like I had owned that role, really to a degree that wasn't super healthy, but where I was then was managing my family. And so the clarity I gained starting at that point, it would not subside.
Yeah. And I know it's interesting you say starting at that point, and I get that, but like the seeds of your questioning life in general started very early on. Yes. Like you told me about an incident in 4th grade where you just said, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Tell us about that incident in 4th grade.
Yeah. So in 4th grade at recess, with my girlfriends, because by that time, right, the boys were doing one thing, the girls were doing the other. And we were walking around the outskirts of an outdoor playing field and having a conversation about church and faith and belief and salvation and heaven and hell. And in the middle of the conversation, I said, yeah, none of that makes sense to me. Like, I don't understand why we would show up here for a few years, and based upon what these few years were like, we would be doomed or destined or rewarded beyond and forever. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. In my language now, I would probably say I'm throwing the bullshit flag, but it didn't make sense. And I claimed it, and then we kind of went on with recess, and that was the last of the conversation.
Yeah. And so you've always had sort of this questioning mentality, and you, as an educator, you certainly understood what it was like to ask a lot of questions, but you also were open to sort of looking at things outside the box, I think was a phrase that you used for me. And you just hadn't had a chance to be exposed to too much of outside the box, if you will, living in the community you lived in. At some point in your son's youth, you told me that you met a very interesting man named Grandpa Bob, we'll call him for the sake of argument, on the sidelines of one of your son's soccer games. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, so this was right at the time that my marriage was disintegrating, and Grandpa Bob, his son, Alex, was playing soccer with my son, Alex. And we just struck up a conversation. First time I had ever met him. And in that very first conversation, he shared, a very intimate part of his life, how he had been so dedicated to his corporate career, so dedicated that he made decisions that didn't involve his family and specifically his wife. And there was a time that the corporation he was with, which was IBM, which was the same corporation that my first husband was with, so it's all very interesting, had asked him to lead a new project across the country, and they needed to know that day. So he said yes, and he went home and informed his wife that they would be moving across the country, at which she said no. And for them, it started this opportunity for growth. And so I asked him, so what did you do? What did you do to grow? Because he's really telling me about this deep growth that he had made. And he said he spent several years in psychotherapy, and he became an avid reader. And as a former English teacher, my next question was, what did you read? And so he handed me a list labeled Bob's List of Books. And on that list included amazing books by the likes of Alan Watts, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, Eric Fromm, the Tao Te Ching. And all of these were somewhat familiar to me with my background in education, particularly as an English major, but I was still quite perplexed how a psychotherapist would give him those books, right? I just wasn't connecting those dots. I proceeded to order and read, and I do really refer to Bob as one of my earth angels. It was an important event in my life.
Yeah. So tell us what you mean by earth angels, and define the term in your words. Earth angel. So first of all, I believe that every single human we encounter, whether it's what we would call, just passing by, or we really have a relationship, I believe we're all here to help each other. I believe there are those special people who agreed to enter into our life at a critical time and maybe even be there just for enough time to have the right impact. Right. So that's how I feel about Bob. I didn't know him well. It was truly like a soccer season, but he had such a profound impact on my life that I still talk about him, right? Yeah. It's fabulous story. I love it. It's wonderful. And you said you actually kind of had a brief encounter with him many years later, just like roads.
Last year.
Yeah. Wow.
Last year. Craig and I walked into an interstate rest stop. Okay, so let's talk random.
Yeah.
And Bob was standing there in the lobby, and I recognized him immediately, and I introduced myself, and I reminded him about that list. And Bob is probably 80 by now, so there was a little bit of reorientation, but it was such a gift for me to get to say to him, I know that you don't know how much impact you had on me.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I mean, that's such a serendipitous closure to the whole experience. Yeah.
Isn't it though? Yeah.
Magical, absolutely magical. Let's go back to the period about 10 years ago and sort of, we'll call it the finding yourself in earnest period, if you will. You're a 41-year-old single mom. You said you literally had no idea what it looked like to have a life without a man in it, right? Because you had a man in your life in some form for your entire life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So, so the first man in my life was my father, true for nearly all women. And I, moved from that relationship to having a high school sweetheart who became my first husband. And so until I was 41, I truly had always had this male figure in my life that was super meaningful to me, that was a powerful influence, and was both a teacher and also a source of opportunity for me to define myself separate from. And that had been my sort of journey to that point, always trying to define myself separate from. And so here I was, 41, and I was separate from any sort of influence or connection to a male figure in my life. And so it was somewhat confusing. Everything I thought I had wanted and the course for my life until that time had shifted dramatically. And I spent those years simply trying to figure out who I was and what this life that I was living looked like.
So you're learning to just be you, basically, right? Yeah.
Yeah, just be
tell
me.
us what some of the things you did to occupy your time were. I mean, what were some of your activities, passions, obsessions?
So my role as a mother was something that gave me great solace, even though at the time of my divorce, my daughter was already in college and my son was in high school. And so at their ages, my role wasn't as significant as it used to be. And I also, while I had always been an avid runner, a dedicated runner, I'll say it that way, I decided to really up my game. And so in those early years of my post-divorce 40s, as I like to call it, I ended up training for and running 2 marathons. So when I go in, I pretty much go all in. And it truly was a time in my life that I, for the first time, had time, could really invest that time in myself. Those hours with my feet hitting the pavement, right? Just me and the open air. Priceless time for me to connect with myself.
It really is. When you get into running in that way, shape, and form, and I've been in that experience, it is one of the most zen things you can do on this planet, in my mind.
Agreed.
So, you're involved a little bit in the post-40s dating scene. In addition to that, you really didn't have any foundation of what it looked like to be a divorced single mother with a partner who wasn't their kid's father. So you wound up finding exactly what you were looking for, which was a secret relationship, right?
Yeah, I actually specialized in either long distance or secret relationships. I can see that so clearly now. At the time, I certainly didn't. But you're right. I had so defined this concept of family. And certainly it was defined from my own childhood. And then I created that in my relationship. And so once my marriage ended, I didn't know what it looked like. And so while I wanted to be in relationship, in part because I wanted a different experience from what I had had, I did not know how to step in and occupy that space comfortably and how to really ask my children to do that. So my solution was just long distance relationships or relationships that were secret, that were did not require me to step in fully. Absolutely. Because that's where I was.
Yeah. So 2008, we're about 8 years back. We're 3 years into your rediscovery of your life period. You're in a yoga class like you've been many times before, but it's not just a regular yoga class. It's a life-changing yoga class. Tell us a little bit about that moment.
Yeah. So first of all, I came to yoga as a runner because I recognized the pounding that I was exposing my body to, right? All of the pounding of the pavement meant my joints and, my spine. And so I just intuitively knew that I needed something different. So I chose yoga, but I only chose those classes that had words like power in them.
I know
so
that. Yeah.
I was in one of those classes, and it looked like, it was a yoga studio. There were women primarily. There were a bunch of mats. It was pretty normal. And then when the teacher started speaking, she began the theme of the class that day as find your truth. Breathe in your truth, breathe out your truth. And every physical movement in the practice was designed to expand the solar plexus, which is the seat of our human power. And soon into that class, it was highly emotional. I was in a relationship that was one of those, secret, covert relationships based in another city. And I was in this yoga class in that other city, and I was pretty miserable. And I heard a audible voice, and the voice said, "You know your truth. You know your truth." That voice was over and over again. So the class ended after an hour. I switched into my running shoes, went outside, hit the pavement. About 5 miles in, I collapsed, literally, on the ground, on the running trail, people zipping past me. I'm sure they thought that I was a little nuts. And it was the same voice, "You know your truth." And I knew the action that I was going to take to end that relationship. And finally, it wasn't just in that relationship, it was in that relationship and claim what's true for you. And so I did that day. And it was empowering and humbling at the same time, but it was a marked shift in my human experience.
Absolutely. And I think you said to me when we were talking about this experience, you said you finally realized that you were worth so much more than this. Right?
So much more. Yeah.
So we know a lot of books have found their way into your life, and in addition to the ones you talked about that Bob, by the way, the books that you've read in your lifetime, mentioned Christine Northrup's book before. There's also a magazine that found its way into your life at a very important time. So at one point you just happened to grab a copy of Oprah magazine and you found, fill in the blank for us.
Found an article written by a woman named Alice Gorman, and her life story sounded a hell of a lot like mine. She was about my age, had a successful career, 2 grown children, divorced after a long-term marriage. Life was great, but, she kind of wondered if there was a relationship possibility for her. And at the advice of a psychic, she wrote a list of 100 characteristics that she desired in a match. She put the list away. Shortly after she wrote that, a man entered her life. They ended up marrying and having a beautiful, beautiful relationship. And that very next day, after I had read that article, sitting at lunch with colleagues, I told them about it, and I said, "I'm writing my list today." Again, all in, right? When there's something that resonates with me, I'm doing it. And so that day, I wrote my list.
Yeah. So that list then led to you creating the blog posts, I guess, or what order did that all happen? So this list became your book, Hear Me Universe. So tell us how this whole thing transpired. fairly important happened in that transition, and he's sitting over there in that screen with a blue shirt on. But tell us
Uh-huh.
about how we went from I'm starting my list to like I've got a book and I'm married.
Mm-hmm. So spring of 2008, I wrote my list,
Mm-hmm.
folded it up, put it in a drawer, and went on with life. And so I do think that that's a really important note, which is I was clear and I declared
Mm-hmm.
my desires, but I didn't attach to them.
Yeah.
And for those of us who have been mentored and trained by Mike Dooley, like that unattachment was so important, but yet I still was claiming, right,
Mm-hmm.
that space. A little bit more than a year later, at the, encouragement of my girlfriends, I decided to try online dating.
Mm-hmm.
And I use that list as my guideline, right? And creating my profile and clicking into all the menus to create my preference. And about 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks later, I invited a guy out for coffee. And the first thing about the guy that really caught my eye was his headline, I think it was called. And the headline read, "I still want it all."
Mm.
Totally resonated with me because, there was definitely a sense for me at the end of my 22-year marriage that somehow I'd missed the boat to have it all,
Yeah.
right? And so when I read that, it resonated. We met for coffee.
Mm-hmm.
I knew immediately that there were so many characteristics that he possessed that I adored and even had named on my list. And so 3 weeks later, perhaps, Craig was leaving for a holiday trip, and I folded up my list. I put it in an envelope. I handed it to him and I said, "Don't read it now."
Mm-hmm.
But this is what it is, and this is why it's important to me. And I see you in this list, and I want to share it with you. So he took a long flight. Up on landing, in our conversation, he said, "Oh, by the way, that list, I scored a 98." And we love that moment, and we both laugh about it. And the truth is, yeah, he is my list, and so much more than I could have ever even known to claim at that point in my life. And so last year in 2016, I decided that I would take this list. So literally it's a 1-page
Mm-hmm.
list of 100 words and phrases.
Mm-hmm.
I decided to take the list and to take each item one by one and expand it into a blog post. So why that item? Why is it important to me? Why did I choose it? Why did I claim it? What was the deeper meaning for me? And I really did that as a way to help women who were intrigued by this concept of, writing a list of 100 characteristics. I wanted to take them a little bit further behind the scenes and see how much of an energetic process creating this list was.
So this list now became your book, which was just published on Valentine's Day of this year, Hear Me Universe, and the pieces continue to fall into place for you. Let's go back a little bit from the time you met Craig to where we're at now, and something very important happened in 2012. Craig found this book called Infinite Possibilities, right? Life-changing for both of you.
Life-changing for both of us. And so I, first of all, just want to take a moment and truly honor my husband, because he's been such a spiritual leader for our family. Mm-hmm. He's been really brave and stepping out in all kinds of ways, including taking a creative writing class, which led him to discover a number of books, which in a ripple effect led him to Infinite Possibilities. Mm-hmm. And I'll always be so grateful for his journey and the influence that it's had on me. And so he read Infinite Possibilities and immediately invited me to read it. And in fact, I believe the first time I read it, we read it together on audiobook, We were on vacation, and so we listened to it on audiobook. And Craig, for those of you who don't know him, his professional background is as an engineer, and so he's very, very interested in processes. And what was presented in Infinite Possibilities felt like a process. And he became super curious, and I think his words were, I'm gonna test this. I'm gonna see if this really works. And so for us, it was a huge change in our lives. That was maybe in October, and the following January we were at our first Infinite Possibilities conference being led by Mike Dooley.
Beautiful. And it's great. Christiana and I share a similar story to how we found Mike, and now is not the time for that story, but I totally get how, two people's lives can be so intimately affected by decisions that one portion of the partnership makes, and it totally makes sense to me. So you said that you've always been open and interested in things outside the box, but it's really been more in the last, say, 5-6 years that you've dove in fully. And in this time, you've done some work with an energy worker who you've mentioned named Viv. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Viv.
Oh, my Viv. The universe connected Viv to me in a very obvious way. I can see now. And she was the first person to really validate for me what I was seeing, what I was knowing, and what I wasn't seeing and knowing, but I believed. So she really held for me this beautiful space to allow me to claim what I believed was true. And that is a gift that I will always be grateful for.
Tell us about the clamshell.
So it's right here.
Oh, good. The clamshell's here. This was not staged, by the way.
In my lap.
What I'm going to ask her tonight. So the fact that she's got the clamshell is perfect.
That's so funny. So I always have it in my lap when I meditate, when I'm with clients, and obviously I chose tonight. So can you see it? So it is, it's a petrified clamshell that Viv picked out for me from her crystal supplier, and she just, it spoke to her and said, Anella needs this. So she delivered it to me, and I've been using it ever since. But about a month after she had given it to me in a session with her, she said, so what does your clamshell tell you? It's like, I don't know. I never ask it anything. She goes, oh, well, I was just curious. You might ask it sometime if there's something that it wants you to know. And so I did, and it was really profound. What it said was, we are ancient. We have always been, and we will always will be. And we are made of the same substance as this universe.
We're going to come back to that in a second, and because it's going to be directly tied to a question that's going to come up. So your mom's still alive. She's 75, right? Your dad passed in 2004 after living with Alzheimer's for 10 years. I know that you're open to connection to spirit on the other side, because we've talked about it in tonight's broadcast even. Tell us a little bit about how your relationship with your dad's spirit has shifted, or how it's different from the relationship you had with your dad's human.
So what I know now is that this life is not the first life that I'd spent with the soul of my father. And this life, he really wanted to show up more than he did for me. And that energy, for many years of my life, created a sadness. I felt his sadness. But what I have been able to step into and feel differently and more fully and in a more uplifting way is that he was just on this particular journey. And he did everything, right, that he knew to do in this lifetime. And it's not our last opportunity to be in support of each other. So there has been this beautiful gentleness. Yeah, gentleness that I've always had in my energy, but it's been solidified by my father's contribution of gentleness and the time that he's been in non-physical.
What a gift that is. And it's empowering to understand that we all have the opportunity to ask for that gift, even if we have unhealed wounds with departed loved ones. So this concept of you being ancient ties very well to the concept of past lives then. And when you were a child, you had a recurring nightmare. Tie that all together for us. Talk to us a little bit about that recurring nightmare, how it relates to your father's former life and past life, your past life. Yeah. I want you to tie this loop up for us now.
Yeah. So as a child, and I was 3 or 4, it was definitely preschool age. I know that for sure. I kept having this recurring nightmare. It was super frightening, in which my father was murdered. And I grew up in a small 2-bedroom ranch. So my brother and I shared a bedroom right across the hallway from my parents. And what ended up happening every single night was I was afraid to go to sleep because I didn't want to have that dream. Yet I didn't want to tell my parents why I was afraid, because I didn't want to frighten or upset my father by telling him I was having this dream about his murder. But the dream was so real. And it was the very same scene, every single dream, every single night. I don't really know how many nights it recurred, but it was significant and it was painful because I was so afraid for his safety. Yeah. And in that dream, the context that I created at that point in my life was that he was murdered by a tenant farmer. So my dad was a farmer. He owned other properties, and those properties had houses, and he rented those. And I don't know, I guess there was some fear I had created in my mind about that. And so that was the context for this frightening dream. So when I, fast forward years later, when I began working with Viv, my energy coach, I shared with her this dream, and I'm sure many people here have had a similar experience where there is a dream that's so vivid and so real. Like I could point out such minute details, a wisp of hair, what the sky was like, something on the breeze, right? Like it was so palpable. And her question to me was, are you sure that was just a dream? And my immediate answer was, no, I know it's so much more, because I had also had a meditation a couple of years before this conversation with Viv, where I reconnected to the energy of that dream. And so I knew from that experience that it was so much more than a childhood dream. And so Viv invited me in this energy session to look at that dream, to go back in. And so we went there together, and the scene that unfolded in front of me was that actually the murder of this man that occurred in that life, that experience that I was therefore bringing into this life as a dream, that experience was actually the murder of my husband in that lifetime. We were pioneers. So picture, Westward Ho, right? Expansion and this little homestead. And I was inside the structure of our home. He was outside, and he was murdered in the very same method, being tomahawked in the back, as I had been dreaming that my father was. And I immediately knew I needed to protect myself, because at that time I was actually pregnant, about 5 months. And so I, tried to kind of shimmy down the wall, across the floor. I hid under a bed. I stayed there as silent as I possibly could for days until a group of sort of neighboring pioneers were making their rounds of checking in and found me and took me with them to care for me. And at that point, I left our home, what we had established, and everything behind, and moved on with my life, which had this, huge gaping hole, this sadness. I gave birth to a son and made the rest of my life in the community of pioneers who became my family.
It's amazing how in both your lives, the one we're talking about, this past life and the life that you've lived up till now, there's that common theme of community and family and motherhood and having a man looking after you in your life. So when your father in his human form in this incarnation crossed over, he'd spent multiple lifetimes with you as your caretaker, both as a husband in a former life and as a father in this life. So even though he suffered from Alzheimer's for 10 years, he wasn't letting go. Tell us about the moment at the end where you gave him permission to let go.
Yeah, so Dad, for about the last 18 months, was completely non-cognitive, non-responsive, and 24/7, Alzheimer's care facility. And my mother would visit him weekly, and I would join her about every month. And so this particular month, my mom had walked down the hallway to have a conversation with some of the staff. And so it was just Dad and me in the room. And again, completely vegetative state. And I leaned in and I said, I don't know who you're hanging on for, but I need you to know that we're all really good. And so then I just verbally began to list everyone that I believed he could have been hanging on for. Mm-hmm. And so I talked about my mom, and I talked about my two brothers, and I spoke about me, and I spoke about my children. And I said, we're all okay. So if you're staying here for us, mm-hmm. we're good. So you can go. And it was about 3 days later when he transitioned. And that is a beautiful, priceless moment for me. And I will always be so, so grateful. And I know he heard me, right? I know he heard me. And I know it's because of our deep, deep energetic connection that we have.
And he hears you right now too.
Yeah.
I asked you to give me a list of people that significantly impacted your life that you have never met. You named Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Jesus, Elizabeth Gilbert, a philosopher named Sark, and Frank Lloyd Wright. Thoughts on that list, please?
Yeah, it seems pretty random, doesn't it? I'll just say I know what resonates with me. And so that entire list resonates with me. So my first career, I was a high school English teacher. I loved teaching transcendental philosophy, right? Which is, it has so many parallels to New Age philosophy. But this belief that we are one, we are connected. I am you, you are me. I am the transparent eyeball, right? Yeah. I am nothing, I see all. I had tremendous passion when I was delivering those units of instruction to my students. Additionally, Elizabeth Gilbert came into my life right at the end of my 22-year marriage. In fact, her book, Eat, Pray, Love, came out shortly after my divorce. My ex-husband actually bought it for me, took me to see her live for a reading where I received an autographed copy, which was super generous of him because I know that he knew I was seeking respite in this world, and she gave it to me in the form of that book. Sark, if you don't know Sark, Google her right away. She is an effervescent spirit who reminds us all to live in the heart of joy. And she does that through her beautifully illustrated books that are filled with whimsical wisdom.
Mm-hmm. So in your office there where you're working, somewhere there's a vision board. Tell us some of the major points on your vision board.
Yeah, so Craig and I actually just redid vision boards at the last full moon, which was really fun. So my vision board is inspired, first of all, with the faces of many, many brave and brilliant women, including Oprah and others, because it's really important to me to not only know about, but to honor in my own journey the path that's been paved by other women in front of me. I feel a responsibility, but not in an onerous way. I feel a responsibility to walk forward in this path that they've cleared, because I know that the sacrifice and the work and the effort and the vulnerability they put forth allows me to be able to walk on a smoother path. So always, always a part. There is always an element or elements of yoga on my vision board. Yoga is a practice that I'm so grateful that I found, and I will never, ever leave. And then the rest of my vision board is made up by beautiful, tangible scenes that I want to experience. So whether it's travel or even just images of awesome fabrics and texture, there's like a richness and a dimensionality to the images that I choose that just resonate with me and make me feel happy.
Awesome. So, you just said this, you worked as a teacher for many years. That was your initial calling. It pulled you into the business world and educational publishing, but your declaration a year ago basically brought you back full circle to your true calling as a teacher. Yes?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So beautiful. So you've accomplished so much in a half a century of lifetime. If you got called home tomorrow to the other side to work with Emerson, Thoreau, and JC, how would you want humanity to remember you? What's the one thing you would want humanity to remember you for?
Yeah, the one thing I would want humanity to remember me for is that I am an amazing mother. Like, mothering for me was second nature. I will say that I read a ton of books at the time that I became pregnant, but I understood the gravity of that role, and I stepped so in. And when my first child, my daughter, was born, it was no more than 15 minutes after her birth when I looked at her dad and I said, we have to do this again. This is really amazing stuff. I looked at this child and there was more love than I knew was possible. And I believe that it was my gift from God to show me what unconditional, deep love really looked like. And so I stepped fully into that. And I know that I have been the absolutely best mother that I could possibly be. And I know for my children that I was the perfect mother. I believe they chose me. I remind them of that often. So I believe they chose me, and I am so grateful and really proud of the fact that I'm their mom.
And now that they're grown adults, we've got the opportunity to have your time so you can teach us all about unconditional love and what a gifted and special teacher you are. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to the wonderful Anella Wetter. Yeah, awesome work, Anella. So we're going to go through a brief couple minutes here where you guys can make comments or ask anything you want to ask. I see you on video, so just kind of wave at me if you want to say something. Anybody have something they want to say to Anella or something they want to ask as a quick follow-up? Hello, anybody? Perfect. So, and this is the way it usually goes. So I'm used to this. Most people like to just absorb the interview and just kind of get the experience. But this is not the end of it all. If you want more information about tonight's broadcast, I've got some good news. You can reach me or Anella. Anella's contact information is at her website, anellawetter.com. And you can reach me at connect@jameshenryherbert.com. And I'll post that on the Stories of the Path website later tonight. There also will be a rebroadcast of this show, which will be available. So if you want to share this with your friends who weren't here tonight, we love to get the word out and have more people see Anella's great story. So within about 48 hours, I'll be posting a replay, and then you can share it with your friends wherever you want to. A couple of other announcements on my end. One of the other monthly programs I do is a program called Discovering Acceptance and Finding Peace, and it's a 90-minute workshop that I do with my friend Mark Offenbacher, and it's for just discovering acceptance in your life. It can be for grief management, it can be for relationship transition, it can be for anything. I think some of you on the call have done it with us before. The next workshop is April 15th, which is a Saturday at 11 in the morning Central Time. I'll have details about that posted on my personal Facebook page, which I think you're all connected to. And then last but not least, this is a monthly program, and I do this on the 4th Wednesday of every month. And each month I kind of figure out who I'm going to do next. I just sort of let the universe direct me to who it's going to be. And I've done a lot of work with this awesome guy named Appio Hunter over the last year and a half. And next month I'm going to interview Appio Hunter, who is a energy coach and just a wonderful channeler of collective from the other side. And he'll be able to speak directly to some of the things Anella was talking about. He does work with Viv on. So it'll be a great opportunity to hear yet another voice within our community of just teachers, lovers of life, coaches, etc. Until then, we're done for tonight. Just keep sharing your stories with other people. Keep listening to other people's stories, and you will keep changing the world. One more time for Anella. Thank you so much. Love you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.